No one warned you about this part. They told you healing would feel like relief, like clarity, like peace. But they didn't tell you about the quiet, not the calm kind, the empty, unfamiliar silence that comes after everything has already fallen apart. This is the phase where nothing is wrong anymore, and yet nothing feels right. You're not in pain the way you used to be. You're not desperate. You're not grieving loudly. But something feels distant, muted, as if the world lost its volume. You wake up, go through your day, speak when necessary, and realize that the emotional urgency that once ruled your life is gone. And no one prepared you for how unsettling that would feel. From the outside, it looks like stability. From the inside, it feels like standing in a room after everyone has left. No chaos, no conflict, just space. Many people panic here. They assume something is wrong. They label it emptiness. They call it depression. They try to fill it quickly, with noise, with people, with meaning borrowed from somewhere else. But this phase isn't a failure of healing. It's a transition. Carl Jung warned about this stage, quietly, across his work. The moment when the old self has dissolved. But the new one has not yet taken shape. A psychological no man's land. You are no longer who you were, but you are not yet who you are becoming. And that liminal space feels deeply uncomfortable to a mind that was trained to survive chaos. This is the quiet phase nobody talks about. The phase where nothing is attacking you anymore, and you don't know who you are without the threat. The phase where the nervous system finally slows down, and the ego panics because it no longer has a role to perform. If you've reached this point, you didn't regress. You advanced. And in this video, we're going to unpack what this quiet phase really is, why it feels so unsettling, and why Jung believed this moment was not something to escape, but something to endure with awareness. Because this silence isn't emptiness. It's preparation. Before this quiet phase begins, there is usually a long history of noise. Not external noise, but internal urgency. For most of your life, your inner world was crowded. Crowded with reactions, with emotional monitoring, with constant adjustment to what others needed, expected, or demanded from you. You were always responding to something. A tone shift in a room, an unspoken tension, a subtle disappointment in someone's voice. Your nervous system stayed alert, not because you were anxious by nature, but because at some point in your life, awareness became necessary for survival. Carl Jung observed that individuals who later enter this quiet phase often spent years in what he called unconscious participation. A state where the psyche is entangled with the emotional atmosphere of others. You didn't just notice emotions. You oriented your entire sense of self around them. You learned early that peace came from anticipation, that safety came from being useful, that belonging came from managing what others could not manage in themselves. So you became skilled. You knew when to speak and when to stay silent, when to soften yourself, when to absorb tension so it wouldn't explode elsewhere. From the outside, this looked like emotional intelligence, maturity, even wisdom. But internally, something else was happening. Your identity slowly fused with responsiveness. You weren't living from your own center. You were orbiting other people's emotional gravity. Jung noticed that when a person lives this way for too long, their psyche begins to compensate. Not immediately, not dramatically, quietly. The unconscious starts collecting data. Every time you override your intuition, every time you explain away discomfort, every time you stay present in situations that slowly drain you, nothing is forgotten. Your conscious mind may call it kindness, patience, loyalty, but the deeper layers of the psyche record it differently. They register imbalance. They register self-betrayal. They register the cost. And this is where many people misunderstand the quiet phase. They think it arrives suddenly, after a breakup, a loss, a collapse. But in reality, it begins long before that. It begins the moment your psyche realizes that the old way of relating is no longer sustainable. The quiet phase is not emotional numbness. It's emotional withdrawal, not from life, but from patterns that demanded constant self-erasure. You may notice that reactions soften first. Things that once triggered anxiety now barely register. Situations that once pulled you into emotional labor no longer activate the same urgency. This often feels unsettling. You might wonder why you're not reacting the way you used to, why you don't feel compelled to fix, rescue, or explain. And because you were conditioned to equate caring with effort. This lack of urgency can feel wrong, as if something essential is missing. But Jung understood this differently. He saw this quiet not as loss, but as the psyche reclaiming energy that had been dispersed outward for years. When the psyche begins to individuate, it must first withdraw projections. That withdrawal creates silence. And silence, to a system accustomed to chaos, can feel frightening. Because for the first time, you are not responding. You are simply present. And that presence is unfamiliar. What makes this quiet phase so confusing is not the silence itself. It's the way you were trained to interpret it. For most of your life, emotional intensity was the signal that you were alive, connected, engaged. Strong reactions meant something mattered. Urgency meant purpose. Emotional friction meant relevance. So when that friction disappears, the mind panics. It searches for a familiar explanation. Depression, burnout, loss of motivation. Something must be wrong. But Jung warned that not every reduction in emotional intensity is a pathology. Sometimes it's a correction. When a psyche has spent years in hyperresponsiveness, the absence of that state can feel like emptiness, not because something is missing, but because something unnecessary has finally stopped. The nervous system, once constantly activated, begins to downshift. And for a mind accustomed to living in reaction, this feels unnatural. You might notice that you don't crave stimulation the way you used to, that conversations feel flatter, that people who once pulled strong emotional responses from you now feel distant, not hated, not rejected, just less relevant. This is where many people misinterpret the quiet phase as emotional loss. But what's actually happening is emotional reorganization. Jung observed that when projections are withdrawn, the psyche enters a temporary state of neutrality. Not joy, not despair, neutrality. And neutrality can feel unbearable to someone whose identity was built around emotional engagement. Especially if caring was your role. If you were the one who felt more, gave more, held more, explained more. In those systems, your emotional output wasn't just personal, it was functional. You were the regulator. When you stop regulating, the system destabilizes. And unconsciously, you feel that shift. You may feel subtle guilt, a sense that you're abandoning something, that you're not being who you're supposed to be. But Jung was clear. Individuation requires the collapse of roles that were never aligned with the self. The quiet phase often arrives when the psyche realizes it no longer wants to perform. Not because you're tired, but because the performance no longer makes sense. You stop narrating your feelings. Stop justifying your boundaries. Stop translating yourself into something more acceptable. And without that constant self-explanation, silence expands. This is deeply unsettling for people who learned that love meant availability, that meaning came from being needed. That value was measured by emotional output. So when that output drops, the mind asks a dangerous question. If I'm not reacting, who am I? This question doesn't get answered immediately. And that gap, That unanswered space is what people label emptiness. But Jung understood that the psyche cannot reorganize itself while constantly reacting. Silence is not the end state. It's the incubation period. You may feel less reactive, but more observant. Less emotional, but more aware. Less involved, but more grounded. This isn't detachment. It's differentiation. The psyche separating what belongs to you from what never did. And that separation always feels strange at first, because it removes the familiar friction that once defined your inner world. The quiet phase strips away emotional noise, before it reveals a new center of gravity. But at this stage, that center is still forming, which is why the silence feels unresolved, incomplete, and tempting to escape. Many people rush to fill this space. They return to old relationships, old dynamics, old identities, not because those things were healthy, but because they were familiar. Jung warned that doing so interrupts individuation. The quiet phase cannot be bypassed. It must be endured long enough for the psyche to recalibrate, not into numbness, but into clarity. If you don't rush to escape this quiet phase, something subtle begins to happen. Your attention shifts, not outward, inward. Without the constant pull of emotional urgency, you start noticing things you couldn't see before. Patterns, not just in others, but in yourself. You begin to recognize how often your energy was spent anticipating reactions, managing impressions, preventing discomfort that didn't actually belong to you. And in the absence of that reflex, awareness sharpens. Jung described this moment as the psyche reclaiming its center. For years, your sense of self may have been defined by responsiveness, by how well you adapted, how quickly you adjusted, how deeply you cared. But now, with less external pressure, a different faculty comes online. Discernment. You start noticing which interactions feel heavy, even when nothing wrong is happening. Which conversations subtly drain you? Which people require you to become smaller, softer, or less honest to maintain harmony? This awareness doesn't come with drama. It arrives quietly, almost clinically. You may find yourself observing situations without the urge to intervene, listening without absorbing, seeing without fixing. And this can feel unsettling at first, because it challenges the identity you once relied on. If you were valued for your emotional availability, what happens when you're no longer available in the same way? Jung understood that individuation requires a phase of selective withdrawal, not isolation, not coldness, but a conscious reduction of unnecessary engagement. The psyche begins to ask a new question. What actually deserves my energy? This is where the quiet phase starts to transform. Not into joy yet, not into purpose, but into orientation. You may notice that you tolerate less noise, less emotional chaos, less performative intimacy. You don't crave intensity the way you once did. What you crave now is coherence, conversations that feel clean, relationships that don't require constant negotiation of your boundaries, spaces where you don't have to explain yourself to be understood. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means caring becomes intentional. Jung emphasized that true psychological maturity is not measured by how much one can endure, but by how clearly one can choose. And choice only becomes possible when reaction slows. In the quiet phase, you may also notice a shift in time perception. Days feel slower. Moments feel more spacious. Not because life is empty, but because you are no longer filling every gap with emotional labor. This space allows previously suppressed instincts to surface. Preferences you ignored. Limits you overrode. Truths you softened to avoid conflict. You may find yourself saying no without rehearsing explanations. Leaving situations earlier, choosing solitude without guilt. These changes are often misinterpreted by others. People accustomed to your availability may sense distance. They may accuse you of being different, less warm, less invested. And in a way, they are right. But not because you've lost something. Because you've stopped leaking energy into places that never replenished it. Jung observed that during this phase, individuals often feel both lighter and strangely untethered. Old motivations no longer drive them, but new ones haven't fully formed. This is the psychological midpoint. The old identity has dissolved. The new one is still assembling. And in that in-between state, silence becomes the dominant experience. Not as punishment, but as preparation. The psyche is reorganizing around a different axis. No longer centered on reaction. No longer driven by obligation, but guided by alignment. You may not be able to articulate this yet, but you can feel it. A subtle internal no where there used to be automatic yes. A pause where there used to be urgency. A calm refusal to engage where there used to be emotional negotiation. This is not withdrawal from life. It's the early formation of sovereignty. The quiet phase never stays internal for long. Even if you don't announce it. Even if you don't explain yourself. The world begins to notice. Because the way you relate has changed. In relationships, this shift is often felt first. You stop filling silence. Stop softening truths. Stop adjusting yourself to maintain emotional equilibrium for others. Not out of resentment, but out of clarity. You may still listen, still care, still feel compassion, but you no longer absorb. You notice when conversations circle endlessly around the same complaints. When emotional intensity is used to avoid responsibility. When closeness depends on your willingness to self-abandon. And instead of intervening, you pause. This pause is deeply unsettling to people who relied on your responsiveness. Partners may feel distance even though nothing hostile has occurred. Friends may sense withdrawal without being able to name why. Family members may feel exposed, as if something that once protected the system is no longer there. Jung observed that when an individual withdraws unconscious participation, the systems built around that participation destabilize. Not because the individual is attacking them, but because the invisible support has been removed. You are no longer smoothing conflict, no longer translating emotions, no longer buffering discomfort. And without that buffer, others are forced to confront themselves. This often leads to projection. You may be told you've changed, that you're colder, less caring, less available. But what they are really responding to is the absence of automatic access. The quiet phase introduces boundaries without speeches, and boundaries without explanation feel threatening to those who benefited from your lack of them. In the workplace, this shift is just as noticeable. You still do your work well, often better than before. But you stop doing emotional labor that was never part of your role. You stop managing tension between colleagues. Stop absorbing stress that doesn't belong to you. Stop overfunctioning to compensate for dysfunction elsewhere. You become precise, efficient, contained. This precision can feel unsettling in environments accustomed to emotional leakage. Managers who relied on your flexibility may feel resistance where compliance once existed. Coworkers who used your availability may feel distance where support once flowed freely. And yet, nothing is wrong. You are simply no longer orienting yourself around what others expect you to carry. Jung emphasized that individuation often creates a temporary sense of alienation. Not because the individuating person is withdrawing from humanity, but because they are no longer participating in collective illusions. You begin to notice how much of social life is built on unspoken agreements of emotional exchange. Who comforts whom? Who listens? Who sacrifices? When you quietly step out of those agreements, the structure shifts. This can feel lonely at first, not because you are isolated, but because the old forms of connection no longer resonate. You may find that certain relationships fall away without confrontation. They simply lose momentum. Not every connection survives when it can no longer extract energy. But something else begins to emerge alongside that loss. Clarity. You start recognizing which connections feel clean, which interactions leave you steady rather than depleted, which people don't demand explanation for your boundaries. These relationships may be fewer, but they are more real. Jung noted that as the psyche consolidates around its own center, quantity naturally gives way to quality. This applies not only to relationships, but to identity itself. You stop defining yourself by roles: caretaker, mediator, fixer, the one who understands everyone. Those labels begin to feel distant, not rejected, just no longer accurate. The quiet phase strips away identities that were built on function rather than truth. And in their absence, there is space. Space that feels uncomfortable before it feels meaningful, because the psyche is still recalibrating, still deciding what matters, still learning how to exist without constant reaction. This is why Jung warned against rushing this stage. The quiet phase is not meant to be resolved quickly. It's meant to be inhabited long enough for a new orientation to take shape, one that is not defined by obligation, but by alignment. What many people don't realize is that the quiet phase is not an ending. It's a reorientation. Nothing dramatic announces it. No sudden clarity. No burst of confidence. Just a slow internal shift. You begin to feel less pulled by external demands, and more anchored in an internal sense of alignment. Not certainty. Alignment. Jung believed that true individuation does not arrive with answers, but with an inner authority that no longer needs constant justification. And this is what the quiet phase is training. You start trusting your internal signals without immediately translating them into action or explanation. If something feels wrong, you don't rush to analyze it away. If something feels right, you don't need permission to honor it. This trust doesn't come from confidence. It comes from repetition, from noticing, again and again, that when you don't override yourself, things become simpler. Not easier. Simpler. Decisions require less emotional negotiation. Boundaries feel less charged. Silence becomes informative rather than threatening. Jung observed that at this stage, individuals often experience a strange paradox. They care less, and yet they become more capable of care, because their energy is no longer scattered. It's conserved. You may notice that when you do engage, you are more present. When you listen, you are not drained. When you give, it is deliberate. This is the beginning of selective engagement, not withdrawal from life, but participation on different terms. The psyche, no longer consumed by constant reaction, begins to invest energy in depth rather than breadth. You may feel drawn to fewer things, but feel them more honestly. You may speak less, but with more precision. Jung understood this as the maturation of consciousness, not expansion outward, but consolidation inward. The quiet phase prepares you to live from choice rather than compulsion, from awareness rather than habit. And this is why it can't be rushed. If you try to escape it too soon, you return to noise, to old dynamics, old roles, old forms of validation, not because they were true, but because they were familiar. The quiet phase asks something difficult of you, to remain present, without immediately knowing what comes next, to tolerate ambiguity, without filling it with borrowed meaning, to let the old identity dissolve, before the new one fully appears. This is where many people abandon the process. They mistake discomfort for danger, silence for emptiness, neutrality for loss. But Jung warned that the psyche needs this interval, a space where nothing is demanded of it, so it can reorganize itself around truth rather than survival. If you are here, you are not behind. You are not broken. You are not fading. You are between. And that between is not a void. It is a threshold. The quiet phase nobody warned you about is not the absence of life. It is the absence of distortion. When the noise falls away, what remains may feel unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It means unconditioned. Carl Jung believed that the most important moments in psychological development often arrive without drama. No applause, no confirmation, just a subtle inner shift where you realize you no longer need to be who you were to belong. You don't stop caring. You stop overextending care into places that require your disappearance. You don't lose depth. You lose urgency. And in that loss, something steadier takes shape. If this video put words to something you've been experiencing, that quiet, unsettling in-between, you're not alone in it. Many people reach this phase and turn back, not because they failed, but because no one told them what it was. If you're still here, still watching, still listening, that tells me something important. You're not trying to escape this phase. You're trying to understand it. If this resonated with you, let me know in the comments. You don't have to explain your story. Even a single word is enough. And if you want to continue exploring these psychological transitions through Jung's work and lived experience, subscribe to the channel. Not for noise, not for answers, but for clarity. When clarity arrives quietly,